You can turn to Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 2. It says, "And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them." And we covered quite a few quotations on that point about not making a covenant, but there's just a couple more. And we're on page 49, if you have the syllabus. And we'll be starting with the fourth manuscript releases, page 85. "Cast out of heaven, Satan set up his kingdom in this world, and ever since he has been untiringly striving to seduce human beings from their allegiance to God." See, he can't force us. That's from fourth manuscript release, page 85. And also I have a syllabus, and if you have that, it's on page 49. So he can't force us to do wrong, but he's always trying to find ways to entice us to go his way. He uses the same power that he used in heaven. The influence of mind on mind. So we need to be careful who we choose as our friends, our close friends, because one person has influence over another person. And also, I think we have to be a little bit careful what church we go to, because some of the way in which church services are being conducted today will not have a good influence over us. And so that's an important principle, the influence of one mind on another mind. Men become tempters of their fellow men. So if one person goes astray, then they cause other people to be tempted. The strong, corrupting sentiments of Satan are cherished, and they exert a masterly, compelling power. Under the influence of these sentiments, men bind up with one another in confederacies. So here's some of the ways that Satan loves to get you into one of these. Confederacy is the first one. Now, a confederacy is when, let's say you want a certain item to go through the church board. So you go around to the other church board members and you talk to them about your viewpoint, and you get them to see it your way before they get to the board. That's a confederacy. And Satan loves to work through confederacies where people feel like they have to agree with so-and-so. It might be you're afraid of losing your job, so you don't speak up on something. Confederacies can be formed very easily in all kinds of ways, and Satan loves to try to get us where we don't stand up for what we believe and know is right. Second one is trades unions. There's lots of unions today in all kinds of areas. They keep growing, into more areas. And when we belong to a trade union, we're not free to make our own decisions. And in secret societies. The most probably well-known one is Masons. They are a secret society, You can always tell whether it's a secret society if, as you advance in position, you get to know more things. In other words, they share more secrets with you. Actually, the Mormon Church is a secret society. They don't make that too plain, but it is. It's a secret society. I have a book which we read a couple times, actually. It's a very interesting book because the ones that were in the book worked at Wildwood, so we got interested. And they came from a Mormon family, and they had relatives that were high up in the Mormon Church. And so that's how they knew that it operated like a cult. And it's really a secret society. There are at work in the world agencies that God will not much longer tolerate. God is not pleased when people get put under pressure to have to do what other people want them to do. God doesn't like that. He wants each one of us free to follow our own conscience, to follow God's word. And so he's going to deal with these groups not long from now. The next one's Fourth Bible Commentary, page 1142. It says, the wicked are being bound up in bundles. And then it gives another list of how he works. Bound up in trusts. So when a trust is formed, that is where a group of people agree to accomplish certain things, and they take away your personal choice. In unions, in confederacies, so that added one new one, trusts. Let us have nothing to do with these organizations. Now, sad to say, very few Adventists are paying attention to these things. And many are working for the union, and sometimes they feel, well, I have to because I need the higher pay, whatever. But when God says don't join, that means don't join. And even if it's lower pay, then we follow what he said. God is our ruler, our governor, and he calls us to come from the world and be separate. So he wants us to be in a position to where we can always do what he wants us to do. And we're not stuck with having to do what somebody else thinks we ought to do. And the last one, Second Selected Messages 143. These unions are one of the signs of the last days. Men are binding up in bundles ready to be burned. So Satan is in this because if he can get people in a situation where they feel like they can't depart from what is wanted, then he knows we got them in this bundle. The leadership will take things in the wrong direction, and we'll carry them with us. And unfortunately, that's what happens. They may be church members, but while they belong to these unions, they cannot possibly keep the commandments of God. For to belong to these unions means to disregard the entire Decalogue. Now, these are pretty strong statements. And if an Adventist believes the spirit of prophecy, they're going to get out of a union if they're in it, and they're not going to join. How can men obey these words? And it's put a text in Luke 10:27, and at the same time pledge themselves to support that which deprives their neighbors of freedom of action. Now, we've all witnessed strikes, I'm sure. I've driven by places of business where men were standing out on the street and you knew they were on strike. Now, sometimes a company has non-union employees too, but the union won't let them go to work. They force them. And if the company was, in order to keep going, if they were going to hire some non-union people, the union ones wouldn't let them in. So that's what Ellen White is pointing out here. When you belong to a union, you force your fellow men in certain areas. You force them. And of course, if you do different, if you're part of the union and you do different than what they want you to do, you're in big trouble. Sometimes they even kill people. Yeah, so, that's a big reason why we should not belong. But there are other reasons as well. All right, we'll move next to Deuteronomy 7, verse 3. It says, "Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son." So God gave very strict instructions, the same ideas in the New Testament, that he doesn't want us intermarrying with those not of our faith. And that goes way back to the beginning, really. In fact, as you read about the flood, the reason why the flood came is because they were intermarrying people who were not godly. And it led them to not be godly. And so God has tried to wake us up on this point, and yet many are not paying attention to it. Let's notice the one in Genesis 6, verse 2 and then verse 5, where this is the first time that this sin comes out of intermarrying with those not of our faith. It says, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair." Now, one of the reasons why the women of the world look better, now they don't look better in some regards. For instance, I don't like the looks of makeup. I don't think they look better with it. But they do spend a liberal amount of time on their looks. And so it could have also been an indication of immodest dress, to attract the men. So they looked at those women and they were interested in marrying them. So it says, "And they took them wives of all which they chose." In verse 5, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." I guess some people read that and they don't see the connection between those two verses. But there is a connection. That when we marry someone who is not a godly person and we are a godly person, when we marry them, it's going to lead us astray in most cases. There might be somebody that can withstand that, but in most cases it leads us astray. And that's why the Bible says in Amos 3:3, "Can two walk together except they be agreed?" In marriage, we have to be united. There's enough areas that even godly people disagree on, to put a few stresses on marriage. But to have the stress of many things we don't agree on, that is not a wise plan. We see it again in Nehemiah 13, verses 25 and 26. Now this is after they were again disobeying the instruction in Deuteronomy. So Nehemiah said, "Ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons, or for yourselves." And then he gives a reason why. Why shouldn't we do that? Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. So you can see his reasoning. He's saying, if Solomon couldn't withstand the influence of heathen women, why do you think you can do it? And so he's instructing the Israelites to not marry those outside their faith. Here's a little bit on Solomon from the 4th volume of Spiritual Gifts, section A, page 100 and 101. It says, Solomon's heart was turned from God when he multiplied to himself wives of idolatrous nations. God had expressly forbidden his people to intermarry with idolatrous nations, for he had chosen them as his peculiar treasure. So, Solomon is a warning to everybody afterward not to do it. Now, of course, probably there's nobody here that's going to be getting married. I guess you're already married, but we do counsel other people, and so we need to be really clear on this so that we can give good advice to them. There's another text in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 7:39. It says, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will. But he adds a phrase, only in the Lord. In other words, only someone who has a belief similar to yours. Now, let me say this. I don't think it's safe to marry just any Adventist, because we know that conversion is a very important factor. Up until conversion, we are a child of the devil. And so if we marry somebody who is not a converted person, then we're going to have a wrong influence in our life, even though they're an Adventist. That was the primary reason. You know, when God gave these instructions, he was giving them from the standpoint that all Israelites were converted, and that they were not to marry the unconverted heathen. But not all Israelites were converted, and not all Adventists are converted. So I realize it's not that easy always to tell whether another person is converted, but if you're around them long enough, you can get a pretty good idea. And so we need to evaluate them on that basis and not be intermingled. Sons and daughters, page 165. One of the greatest dangers that besets the people of God today is that of association with the ungodly. So even association is a danger, not what I call social to save. In other words, if we're visiting somebody to try to get Bible studies with them or to give them Bible studies and so on, that is not harmful. It's when we just go and we do the same things they do, and we're just their friend, that's where the danger comes in associating with the ungodly. But even worse than that, it says, especially in uniting themselves in marriage with unbelievers. With many, the love for the human eclipses the love for the divine. So their desire to have their partner, like them, or to give them what they want, they go along with things that the partner wants them to do. That's why there's such a danger. They take the first step in backsliding by venturing to disregard the Lord's express command. So just marrying an unbeliever, God says, you took the first step in backsliding, just by that decision alone. And complete apostasy is too often the result. It has ever proved a dangerous thing for men to carry out their own will in opposition to the requirements of God. So, a lot of people might say, well, I can be faithful. And another one I've heard is, well, I'll win them to the Adventist faith. I would say most of the time that doesn't work. Once in a while one does. You remember with Solomon? The first wife, heathen wife that he married, he won her to the Jewish faith. And so he thought, well, I can do it. And he married a bunch of others, but never did he win another one. Only that first one. Yet it is a hard lesson for men to learn that God means what he says. As a rule, those who choose for their friends and companions persons who reject Christ and trample upon God's law eventually become of the same mind and spirit. So this is broader than marriage, although that is the most dangerous. And we need to be careful. I don't know that I can draw an exact line between what is good to be social for the purpose of saving people. Jesus was mingling continually with sinners. We know that from the Bible. But he never allowed them to influence him in his views or his actions or whatever. And so, where is that line? But the best line I can draw is when we pick them as our buddies, and they're not converted people, then they're going to have an influence over us for the bad. Yes?
My granddaughter lives with me, and she's 12. She'll be 13 next month. And we go to Decatur Church, and there's some pretty worldly people that go to that church. And they want to make jewelry and stuff. And so Jules kind of get close to the daughter, this daughter, and she's a couple years older than her. And she wanted Jules to come spend the night one Saturday night. And I said, sure, you can go over there. And then I said, the only thing I don't like is I don't like the fact that she wears jewelry and I don't care for her clothes.
Mm-hmm.
And so she came back the next day and she had some black stuff on her face. She had painted toenails. And I try not to be too, forward with her because I don't want to scare her and thinking she has to do stuff. I want her to do
Right.
what the Bible says,
Right.
And so I told her, I said, Jewel, did somebody hit you? And she says, no, Grandma. And she gets up and runs to the bathroom, and she goes back, it's all washed off. And ready to play with my makeup and stuff.
Yeah.
And then in a few minutes, I said, I see that you painted your toenails. I said, Jewel, would you have done that if Grandma wouldn't have been there? No, Grandma. I said, well, you're going to have to learn to say no, you're not going to be able to go over there.
Mm.
And you have to be an example to her.
Right.
And she just went last weekend again. And the week before that, at church, she had given her a little chain to put around her ankle.
Mm-hmm.
And it was dangling off her ankle, and Mama noticed it, and my mom noticed it too. And she said, look, she's got it around her ankle. So I told Jill, I said, where'd you get that? She said, Linda gave it to me. I said, and why are you wearing it? And she said, because she gave it to me. I said, and why are you wearing it? And so she took it off and she put it on her kitty cat. But I told her, I said, you need to tell Lindy what the Bible says about that.
Mm.
I need to teach her it's her responsibility since Lindy doesn't know. She has to step up. And if she doesn't step up, I'm going to stop her from going over there.
That's a wise thing.
Yes, she has to be the leader, not the follower.
The younger people are, the harder it is to resist that type of thing, you know. And it's unfortunate that there's so many in the church like it, because it really pulls on our young people to see that. All right, Fifth Testimonies, page 363. We're looking at Deuteronomy 7, verse 3, where it talks about not marrying unbelievers. It says, let women give herself to Christ before giving herself to any earthly friend, and enter into no relation which shall conflict with this. So there's the bottom line rule for marriage. That we belong to Jesus. If we don't belong to Him, it's not safe to get married. You know? But if we belong to Him, then we must not get connected with anyone that doesn't belong to Him also. And that Jesus doesn't tell us to put our attention upon them. Enter into no relation which shall conflict with this. Those who would find true happiness must have the blessing of heaven upon all that they possess and all that they do. It is disobedience to God that fills so many hearts and homes with misery. Satan is always presenting to us, well, it doesn't matter that much. It's not a big issue. You can go ahead. And he knows that if we disobey, we will pay the price. And so he's always after that. My sister, unless you would have a home where the shadows are never lifted, do not unite yourself with one who is an enemy of God. So, I guess I skipped to one other sentence there. It is disobedience to God that fills so many hearts and homes with misery. I have seen, I imagine you've seen it too, homes that neglected this, and truly that sentence has been fulfilled. A home where the shadows are never lifted. And I suppose there's no day where it's worse than Sabbath, because the partner is not interested in keeping the Sabbath, and so either they have to stay away from home all day Sabbath, or they're constantly confronted with things that the partner's doing that are not right on Sabbath, and there's invitations to do things and so on. So I've seen the truthfulness of this statement. As one who expects to meet these words in the judgment, I entreat you to ponder the step you contemplate taking. Ask yourself, will not an unbelieving husband lead my thoughts away from Jesus? He is a lover of pleasure more than a lover of God. Elder Frazee said in the class that I took from him, he said, if you marry a child of the devil, you will have trouble with your father-in-law. And, that's very, very true. Will he not lead me to enjoy the things that he enjoys? The path to eternal life is steep and rugged. Take no additional weights to retard your progress. Most people that neglect this counsel will not make it to heaven. Unfortunately, their partner will influence them enough that they miss out. You have too little spiritual strength, and you need help instead of hindrance. So we need someone that's going to encourage us in the path toward heaven and not drag us down or keep inviting us to go in the wrong direction. Though the companion of your choice were in all other respects worthy, which he is not, yet he has not accepted the truth for this time. He is an unbeliever, and you are forbidden of heaven to unite yourself with him. So I believe there's a double definition of who is an unbeliever. It's a non-Adventist because they have not accepted the truths that Adventists believe. And it's an unconverted person, even if they're an Adventist. So if we follow that definition, we'll be safe. If we, get to the point where we want to marry. Now, in 5th Testimonies 3:65 and 6, it says, the people of this generation are marrying and giving in marriage with the same reckless disregard of God's requirements as was manifested in the days of Noah. So we are repeating the days of Noah. Now, it's not wrong to get married, obviously, but the obsession with marriage is what this is talking about. We can't find a converted Adventist, and so we decide to marry a non-Adventist. Or we're not free, according to the Bible, to remarry. But we want to be married. So we go ahead and marry anyway, even though we're not free, biblically. That is a fulfillment of what they were doing in Noah's day. They were obsessed with marriage. And so we need to be careful. Now, when I was in college, I remember some of the young ladies telling me why they were dating non-Adventists. And they said, well, he is better than the Adventists. And I knew what they were talking about, because the Adventist fellows on the first date wanted to hold hands and maybe even kiss on the first date. And the girls, some of them were fed up with that, and they found some non-Adventist guys, and they didn't do that. And so it led them to think it was better to go with a non-Adventist. Well, I don't think so. We can't afford to go against this. And if she can't find an Adventist that's converted and will not do that, or if she doesn't have the courage to say, no, I'm not interested in that, often the ladies have to be the strong ones on that point, I believe, and they just have to say, no, we don't accept that. And she might not want to do it because she thinks he will not be interested, but actually he will be more interested because he respects her for her principles, and yet so few will, stand up and do that. There is in the Christian world an astonishing, alarming indifference to the teaching of God's Word in regard to the marriage of Christians with unbelievers. Many who profess to love and fear God choose to follow the bent of their own minds rather than take counsel of infinite wisdom. And sad to say, there are pastors today that will encourage young people to date non-Adventist people. And, you know, what they don't reckon on is that if you date a non-Adventist and you start really liking them, will you stop? Most people won't stop. And so for a pastor to encourage them that it's okay to do it, I've heard it with my own lips at a youth rally, encouraging the young people, if you're in a church where there's no Adventist guys or no Adventist girls, it's okay to date a non-Adventist. I couldn't believe that I would hear that counsel. In a matter which virtually concerns the happiness and well-being of both parties for this world and the next, reason, judgment, and the fear of God are set aside, and blind impulse, stubborn determination is allowed to control. The old human nature is coming out there. You know, we all have those tendencies down deep in our heart. And if we belong to Jesus, we have a power to resist those. But if we don't, we get determined to have our own will. We get to thinking, well, it doesn't matter what God said, we can do different. Men and women who are otherwise sensible and conscientious close their ears to counsel. You know, I've counseled some people, I've warned them against what they were going to do, but to my knowledge, there wasn't one that ever listened. And yet we're responsible to tell them if we know, you know, that they're making a serious mistake, we are responsible to tell them. I told one man, I said, you're not free to marry somebody else. And it wasn't too long before his wedding, and he never even answered me back. And of course, he went right ahead, got married. They are deaf to the appeals and entreaties of friends and kindred and of the servants of God. The expression of a caution or warning is regarded as impertinent meddling. And the friend who is faithful enough to utter a remonstrance is treated as an enemy. All this is as Satan would have it. He weaves his spell about the soul, and it becomes bewitched, infatuated. Reason lets fall the reins of self-control upon the neck of lust. Unsanctified passion bears sway until too late the victim awakens to a life of misery and bondage. This is not a picture drawn by the imagination, but a recital of facts. When I read that, I think of one particular young lady that was in love with a young man at Wildwood. And I recognized that she was converted, but he wasn't. And so I told her, don't marry him. And I wasn't the only one that told her, don't marry him. But she went ahead and she married him. And now, every so often, I get phone calls, desperate phone calls. What do I do? It's terrible how things are going. Last call that came in, things had improved a little. I haven't been called for a while, so I'm hoping, for the better. But how true this is, and God doesn't want His children to have to go through these things. God's sanction is not given to unions which He has expressly forbidden. For years, I have been receiving letters from different persons who have formed unhappy marriages, and the revolting histories opened before me are enough to make the heart ache. So she had an advantage that we don't have. God showed her in vision how some people's marriages were. And it usually was for the purpose of trying to help them so they could, face it the best they could. But her wording here is revolting histories. Open before me are enough to make the heart ache. It is no easy thing to decide what advice can be given to these unfortunate ones, or how their hard lot can be lightened. But their sad experience should be a warning to others. So, it is possible. Daniel stood up against every evil influence that was around him. And it is possible to do that. But there'll still be lots of heartache, because marriage is a relation between two people. And you can make your own choice, but you can't make their choice. And so this is why we as Adventists have been given some very strong advice on this question. Conflict and Courage, page 57. No one who fears God can without danger connect himself with one who fears him not. Can two walk together except they be agreed? The happiness and prosperity of the marriage relation depends upon the unity of the parties. But between the believer and the unbeliever, there is a radical difference and it gives a little list of tastes. So even at mealtime, we might not even want to eat the same things. But taste is a broader word than just meals. And so taste in what kind of car we drive, what kind of furniture, what kind of furnishings, what kind of house we live in. Tastes, inclinations, what you want to do. It's totally different between those. And purposes. One might be interested in being a missionary, but they can forget that, except the home missionary, the neighbors around them and so on. But they can never go to the mission field. Their partner's not going to be interested in that. So taste, inclinations, and purposes are totally different. They are serving two masters, between whom there can be no concord. However pure and correct one's principles may be, the influence of an unbelieving companion will have a tendency to lead away from God. And your story about your granddaughter, now's the time to teach her before she starts wanting a boyfriend. We've got to start young with them to convince them about this.
We've already told her that we're going to be riding in the car with her on her first date.
Yeah.
My son does that. He has a daughter.
Uh-huh.
And every time she's gone on a date, they've gone with her.
Okay. Well,
Texts her and make sure nothing's going to happen.
amen. Amen. Adventist Home 94 and 5. Christianity ought to have a controlling influence upon the marriage relation. In other words, if we're a real Christian, we will not want to do anything that Jesus told us not to do, and unless we know that He approves of it, we're not going to move forward. That's the true Christian. But it is too often the case that the motives which lead to this union are not in keeping with Christian principles. Unfortunately today, most young people get married not because they're compatible, not because they really belong together, but because they've been conducting physically with each other, and so they really feel good about each other and they want to get married. That unfortunately, and that is supposed to never be the foundation for marriage. Never. From the true Christian, there's something else, that makes up the decision. Yes, it should be somebody we enjoy being around, somebody that we feel we can love, but it needs to be on a totally different basis. If so, then we have a good chance at a happy marriage. Satan is constantly seeking to strengthen his power over the people of God by inducing them to enter into alliance with his subjects. And in order to accomplish this, he endeavors to arouse unsanctified passions in the heart. So Satan is really working today. If you have any weakness at all, you're being bombarded on posters, magazines, catalogs, TV, internet. It's just a bombardment. Satan is trying to stir up that side of our nature. But the Lord has, in His Word, plainly instructed His people not to unite themselves with those who have not His love abiding in them. And there's one more, and we'll close with that. It closes off a section here. 4 Testimonies 5:04. Many imperil their own souls and bring the curse of God upon them by entering into the marriage relation merely to please the fancy. I have been shown the cases of some who profess to believe the truth, who have made a great mistake by marrying unbelievers. The hope was cherished by them that the unbelieving party would embrace the truth. But after his object is gained, he is further from the truth than before. And then begin the subtle workings, the continued efforts of the enemy to draw away the believing one from the faith. Now I've noticed another danger which is not listed in these quotes. But even if they become an Adventist, they may not be a very dedicated Adventist. And so they draw their partner away from what they would have been otherwise. And there's just a lot of dangers in going against what God told us. And so I hope we'll be busy educating those around us. There's not much education going on today in this line, but we need to be educating those around us and doing all we can to help them see the dangers, because once it's done, then the Bible doesn't say you can break up the marriage. It doesn't say you can do it. And so now you have to try to make it to heaven with carrying that extra problem. And God can still help a person if they repent and recognize their error and ask God to help them. But how much better it would have been if they hadn't done it.